Hello everyone and welcome to another game from the Altibox Norway Championship. It's from the final round and Magnus Carlsen is already the winner, but we have a very interesting game between him and Levon Aronian. Aronian with the black pieces, so I decided to show this one as well. And then I'm gonna go through your comments if any of you guys used a hashtag suggestion to go through all and any games that might have been interesting. If you guys have an interesting game, you can still suggest it using hashtag suggestion in the comments. Now, getting back to this game, it's really an exciting one because it's hard to play, especially for Magnus. He already won the tournament and he already lost his not losing streak when he lost to Duda, also in this tournament, so there's not much for him to gain in this tournament anymore, there's always a 11 to beat. So let's see what happened here. Magnus opens with knight to f3. He goes for the reti opening. We have d5 by 11, d4, and knight to f6. And, sorry about that. And through a bit of a different move order, we have c4, e6, knight to c3. We again have the queen's gambit declined on the board. We have bishop to e7 by 11, and now a nice trade in the center by Magnus. Captures, and bishop to f4. We have c6, controlling the knight, strengthening the center, and queen to c2. A nice developing move, preventing the bishop from being developed to f5, and now g6. Levon says, okay, I might be castling kingside. I mean, I probably will be castling kingside, and also I now have support for bishop to f5. So Magnus prepares for that. He plays e3. He's preparing to block bishop to f5 with bishop to d3. And that's exactly what we have. Bishop to f5 and bishop to d3 is the main move. There have been other attempts here, like moving the queen to d1 or b3, but Magnus plays the main theory. So bishop to d3, and we have captures. And now knight b to d7. At some point, this knight is coming to e5, so you do want a knight on d7 to kind of control that square. Also, you are maybe in some variations preparing c5, the rook can come to c8, and so on. And here, there are a couple of moves that have been played here. Castles is very popular, h3 is very popular, but the move Magnus plays is a new move, and it is, in fact, the position from the thumbnail. It is the h4 move, and it's kind of poetic as playing h4 against Levon Aronian. He always plays h4 in any position. Like you give him any position with white, he's going to find a way to play h4. And this is exactly what Magnus does against him. So it's gonna be very interesting. And if he just continues like with normal development, let's say he castles, and do you really want to face h5? I mean, it's such an uncomfortable position to play, especially, I mean, even for a classical game. Even if you capture, let's say you open up the position queen f5, you're gonna castle queenside, you're bringing the rook to h1. I mean, it's such an ugly position to play for black, even though it's probably okay and you can defend. But okay, after this h4 move, Levon decides, okay, we're not going anywhere near that. We're just gonna play a5. First, we're gonna prepare for castling, and we're gonna castle then. And Magnus plays king to f1. He says, I'm not castling kingside or queenside. I just want my king to be at least a little bit safe. You don't have a light square bishop, so I don't have to worry about any trickery. And my rook is going to be lifted via this h file here. So we have a4 and a3, of course, not allowing a3 by 11, and queen to b6 now, putting pressure on the b2 pawn. We have queen to c2, Magnus defends it, and now h5. Levon prevents Magnus from pushing the h-pawn all the way, and he says, okay, now that everything is nicely set, I'm gonna only castle now. So bishop to g5 by Magnus, and castles by Levon. We have knight to e5. Now with threats of capturing the knight, so after you recapture, the bishop hangs on e7, so Magnus, of course, Levon needs to defend that. So rook f to e8, and only now does Magnus trade. Here there is the possibility of knight captures on g6, but it's very hard to decide all the way what happens here. For example, knight captures on g6, f captures, and queen captures. You do get your queen all the way to h6, but after king to h8, it's hard to say if you will be able to actually do something here. Yes, you do have some options of a rook lift, but it's I mean, it's very hard. The b2 pawn is hanging, could be a problem, and you don't really have any pieces left to attack with. So maybe it's playable, maybe it's some sort of a forced draw. Either way, Magnus not interested in it. So he goes bishop captures on f6, knight captures, and now rook to h3. Finally getting that rook into the game. There's always time to capture on g6, and here captures on g6 could be a problem now because the rook is ready to help out with the attack. So immediately Levon goes for queen to b3. He offers a queen trade. Magnus needs to keep an eye on the b2 pawn, so queen back to b1. He could trade queens here, and he probably would if this was some sort of a game where he needed points in the tournament or something. But he continues with the aggressive queen to b1, so still keeping an eye on the g6 pawn while locking in his rook on a1. And here Levon finds a beautiful pawn sacrifice with knight to e4. And it's a very interesting pawn sacrifice because it will align Carlsen's queen with Levon's rook. So here he goes for it. We have captures, captures, and captures. And now bishop to d6. Again, not allowing any captures on g6 because now the queen will be hanging here. And you still have some issues here. The b2 pawn is hanging, so you have to defend against everything well. And Magnus just continues attacking. Rook to g3. Just going all in. So now you really have to be careful. Like rook captures on g6 will be a huge problem. Queen captures, the knight is coming to f7 or to d7, depending on where the black king goes. Could be very problematic. So here Levon immediately takes care of that. Bishop captures on e5, d captures on e5, and now queen to b5 with check, re-grabbing the pawn here and regaining material balance. So here we have king to g1 by Magnus and rook captures on e5. And now we have this position where it's 6 pawns each, a queen and 2 rooks, and well, Levon's king is somewhat more wide open, but you know, that's nothing really if it doesn't work. And for example, something like rook captures here, still just king h7, and now white is just lost. Everything is hanging here. So instead, we have a queen to d4, getting the queen out of harm's way, and now rook to d5, continuing the harassment. Queen to f6, again with ideas of some nasty rook captures, but just rook to f5. Levon says, nope, that doesn't work, and it's a classical game. I have all the time in the world to calculate everything out. So here, if you go for it, we can show it. It's quite a king walk, so we will show it because they had to calculate all of this out during the game. King f8, you could harass with queen h6, and now it's either a perpetual. However, king goes to e7, and you do run away. For example, queen h7 check, rook f7, queen e4 check, king d7, and you even allow rook to d1 check, because after king to c7 there are no more checks to be delivered, and well, you're just gonna play rook to d8 and get the other rook into the game and win this game easily. You're up a whole rook. So after this rook to f5, we have queen back to d4. Magnus says, okay, we still cannot sacrifice anything. And now queen to e2, going after the counterattack, now threatening to capture on f2. So here e4, defending while attacking, and rook back to b5. We have rook to b1. Now there's a double attack on the pawn here, so you don't want to allow rook captures. Magnus needs to defend it. Rook to b1. And here, queen to c2, threatening the rook, saying, okay, you move the rook, and only then will I capture the pawn here. But Magnus says, nope, we're not going to play that. We are now going straight into the endgame, and now, only now, Magnus trades down with queen to d3. Levon says, okay, we can trade, but we are trading on my terms. I want my rook to be able to go to the second rank when the trade happens. And Magnus says, okay, that's fine. We have queen captures, rook captures, and b3. Getting rid of the backwards b2 pawn and going into a rook endgame, well, 2 rooks both with equal pawns on the board. We have b5, Levon defends, and now rook to d3, grabbing hold of the open d file for his rook. We have captures, captures, rook b captures on b3, and now rook to a4. Levon goes for the e4 pawn, and for the moment, not defending with f3, it's perfectly fine, but Levon decides to go for, Magnus decides to go for rook d to c3. He wants to trade that pawn for this pawn. And okay, we have rook to c4 by Levon, and now rook captures on c2. We have rook captures on c2, and only now f3 defending, so not going for that trade. Deciding to keep a pair of pawns each. And only now Levon starts bringing his king into the game. King f8, and Magnus does the same the other way around. King h2, king e7, king h3, and now king to e6. We have rook to d3, cutting the king off from the d file, and now rook to c4. So everything is nicely defended. We have king to g3 and now king to e5. So Levon with a lot more active king. It's not easy for Magnus to find moves, and Magnus really took a lot of time So it was a bit of a different situation than in Carlsen's game against Alireza. In Carlsen's game against Alireza, he had infinite time, whereas Alireza had very few minutes, and it's like that in this game. So it's Levon who has all the time, and it's Magnus who's grasping for seconds, as he really spent a lot of time calculating everything that can happen in that entire attack. So here, rook to d7, Magnus goes after the f7 pawn, and now rook to c3. Levon says, okay, we can trade captures for captures, but for the moment, Magnus defends. Rook to a7, but now f6. Levon says, okay, you don't want it, I'm gonna save it. We have rook to a8 by Magnus, and now we have king to d6. Here you could go for rook to b3 and start pushing your pawn right away. That's one way to go about it. But Levon says, nope, we're gonna guard these pawns, and then if you want to go after these pawns, I'm gonna eliminate this guy and start pushing my two connected pass pawns. And Magnus says, okay, but first let's improve the position of the king a little bit. Here Magnus goes king f4. And now king to c7. We have g4 by Magnus, and now king to b7, kicking the rook out of the way. Rook to g8, and only now h captures on g4. So we have, h captures on g4, we have f captures on g4, and now rook captures on a3, eliminating that pawn. Rook captures on g6, and now it's 2 pawns Levon, 3 pawns Levon, 3 pawns Magnus, well, it's definitely a race. So here Levon starts pushing, because that's what you have to do when you have passed pawns. We have b4, and now, only now, feel free to pause the video and find the absolute best move for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not capturing the f6 pawn, because that simply doesn't work and it loses the game. So if you found g5, that's fine. If you found h5, that's fine. If you found the rook to g7, that's fine. But if you've captured, that's not fine. And this is exactly what Magnus played, and this just shows that even he is a mortal when facing well, a strong opponent in an equal endgame in time trouble. Here we're just going to show one line, for example, rook g7 check, king b6, not allowing this, and now rook to g8. And now you constantly threaten this rook to g8 check, so even if this pawn advances all the way to b2, you can just deliver a check and pick it up. And for example, b3, g5, let's say captures, and now if black tries to go something like king c7 or anywhere on these squares, of course preventing the rook from reaching this, you just kick him back. Rook g7 check, he goes back, and then you go back. And now if he ever pushes the pawn, you always have this check, and you're gonna pick up the pawn. And if he tries something like king c5, trying to be all sneaky, then you go rook to b8, you have a rook behind the passed pawn, and now it's black who's in big trouble, because now the pawn is marching up the board. So these are only some of the options possible here after this b4 move by Levon. However, Magnus decided to capture the f6 pawn, and this is just, well, this is just incredible what happens here, because now Levon pushes b3, and how do you stop the passed pawn? Well, h5, just b2. There's no stopping the passed pawn. So this is what Magnus thought that works. Rook f7 check, king to b6, and rook to f8 now. So it seems like the idea is completely the same. If the pawn is pushed, you can simply do this. But it's not, because now rook to a7, and you have problems here. Because now, for example, if the rook blocks, you can just block with your own rook. So here, rook to b8 check by Magnus, and now rook to b7, just blocking the rook, and now you're still threatening to, well, queen your pawn. So here, rook to d8 by Magnus, sorry, that's not a d8, rook to d8 by Magnus, preparing to bring the rook over to d1 is if the pawn is pushed, but now Levon starts pushing the c pawn as well. And the fact of the matter is, his pawns are just far more advanced than Carlsen's pawns. So here, king to e3. Magnus decides, okay, you win the race, but maybe I can stop the pawns with my king. c4, Levon says, okay, you're more than welcome to try. Rook d1, and now c3. And this is always very unpleasant. Due to that grabbing of the pawn on f6, you can see just how fast Levon's pawns are rolling down the board, whereas Carlsen's pawns are standing exactly where they are. So rook to b1, hoping to get rid of that guy here, but just king to c5. Now the rook defends the pawn, and c2 is coming. We have king to d3 by Magnus, But after playing king to d3, it was also on this move, on move 58, that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game, as he, of course, realized that there is nothing more to be done here. After king to b4, there is not much for you to do. Your pawns are so far behind, you can start pushing, but after c2, rook anywhere doesn't really matter, just b2 and it's game over. There's no way to play this. And of course it's completely winning for Levon. So it was a completely crazy game. Magnus went all out. He decided to have some fun. He already won the tournament. He already lost his not losing streak, and well, it was just a fun attacking game where a lot of things could have happened. That g6 square was always the question whether to go for it or not, but it never actually worked, even for grabbing for a draw. But yeah. In the end, Levon wins, and what a victory it is, with the black pieces in a classical game against none other than world champion Magnus Carlsen. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I will go through your hashtag suggestions, so if you have an interesting game I've missed, do suggest it. We're going to show it, as I'm planning to show a few more games from the tournament, and then we're going to check out the final standings to see what's what, as so far we've only shown Carlsen's games, and I'm pretty sure there were some very interesting games played in this tournament, so do suggest them. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Vincent Natale, Sudarshan Nagesh, Gabriel Gross, Anthony Ryan, and David Ricard for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing this very, very short coverage of the Altibox Norway Championship, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day. And do check out the interview with Levon Aronian after this game. It's the first thing you'll see in the description below. See you soon, guys.